Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the current status of some of the countries that have participated in the Arab Spring? What can be done to reduce the hostilities between the Palestinians and the Israelis? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the Middle East, and there are certainly there's a myriad of problems going on in the Middle East, but I would like to welcome everyone back to Global Connections Television. As our regular viewers know, Global Connections Television is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Again, today we're taking a look at the Middle East, and my guest is an expert in this area. My guest today is Dr. Michael Cairo. Dr. Cairo is an associate professor of political science and the director of the International Affairs program at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky, USA. Dr. Cairo has previously taught at Virginia Commonwealth University, the Stevens Point, and Georgetown College, and a variety of others. His first book, The Gulf, The Bush Presidencies and the Middle East, was published in November 2012 and focuses on conflict, diplomacy, and peace. Dr. Cairo has written numerous book chapters and book reviews focusing on American diplomacy. His next project will examine American diplomacy in the Middle East peace process from President Lyndon Baines Johnson to President Barack Obama and their administrations. Dr. Michael Cairo, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for having me here today.
I appreciate you being with me today.
Well, I appreciate what you do on this program. It's very important for us.
We're trying to get the information out, and you've got a lot of information with your book and a variety of other things. But let's jump right into it and talk about the Arab Spring. What exactly, where are we with the Arab Spring? We had Libya that participated. It started, I think, in Tunisia, if I'm not incorrect. Yes. And then Libya and a variety of other, it's moved across into Syria. But where? Is there a broad generalization we can make about it or not make about it?
Well, I think that's the first thing, is that it's difficult to make a broad generalization. One of the problems there is that you've got various countries in the Middle East and various types of governments, although mainly authoritarian, but also various types of ethnic makeups, tribal makeups, religious makeups, depending on which country you're talking about. If you take Egypt, for example, which is experiencing yet another Arab Spring, one might suggest, on the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of their process. Egypt is a country that, of course, had authoritarian rule under Hosni Mubarak, and the consequences of that, in part, weren't just centralization of power, but also centralization of the economic system. The government was providing goods to the people, and when the economy started to go bad and they couldn't provide goods to the people, a lot of the protests you saw were economically driven. Now today you see opposition in the streets against Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. And that opposition is also protesting no better position than they were 2 years ago, to some extent. So.
This is interesting, and of course, I guess all of the countries are experiencing similar situations, but they're all different to a large degree. Yeah. But I remember in Libya in particular, I know it was the United Nations Security Council that voted overwhelmingly to set up the no-fly zone, and that gave legal cover for NATO to come in, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to have their jets to protect civilians from being attacked by Gaddafi's army and his military machine. And of course that mission expanded itself. But after the UN did that, I noticed that even though the UN was actively involved in Libya, for example, on the ground, the United Nations World Food Program was providing assistance. You had hundreds of thousands of civilians that were on the move, that were fleeing the fighting. You had the UN High Commission for Human Rights that were there monitoring the situation, that UN High Commission for Refugees, setting up tents and providing provisions for people. You had the UN Children's Fund to help
Right.
maternal and child health needs and that type of thing. But I read very little or almost nothing about that in the media around. Maybe overseas the media covered it, but in the United States they just seem not to focus on that.
Yeah, well, I think some of that's a consequence of an organization that has great power, involvement, and leadership. And when the United States does take the lead in the United Nations, one of the great challenges is to try and outshine the United States in the process. Now, in Libya, there was some irony because the United States wasn't necessarily taking the lead in a lot of that. You know, the French, the Italians, the British had a much larger role in some sense publicly, at least in the initial part of the process. And once the United States got involved, though, or was backing, I think that some of that goes to the factor that the United States itself is oftentimes, particularly in the United States, deemed to be the UN when it's acting in concert with the UN. And so that creates a problem for the UN public relations-wise to deal with this, with these kinds of things.
It certainly does. And I think the American media, too, have a tendency to be a little more ethnocentric.
Insular.
Insular.
Insular
That's
is the way
good
to
word.
think about it.
It certainly is.
Absolutely, because you know, they're not going to get as much play out of saying the UN did X today. They're going to get a lot more play out of saying President Obama announced he was or NATO was doing X today. So
it certainly
it's
is.
going to focus the attention better.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, let's go to another country in that area of the world, one that's gotten a lot of publicity, and that's Syria.
Yes.
And of course, we've seen that the situation in Syria, a lot of people wanted to see a rerun in Syria of what happened in Libya, but we've not seen that up to this point, primarily because the Russians and the Chinese, primarily on the Security Council at the United Nations, have not been in agreement as far as giving the green light.
We have seen a rerun in one respect, and that is Bashar al-Assad is taking a playbook from his father, who in the early 80s for 3 years basically went into the same communities that his son's going into now, and did the same kind of massacres to eliminate opposition at the time. So there is a rerun. It's not the kind of rerun we necessarily want to see, but there is a rerun in some connections there to the past in that sense.
Exactly.
So.
Well, we've got some video of some action scenes in Syria. Let's take a moment, look at that, and we'll come back and talk about it. But let's go to the video.
Okay.
2012. Climate change made headlines. Countries struggled between turmoil and transition, putting the United Nations to the test to negotiate peace and define a future we want for all. In Syria, violence spiraled out of control. Fighting and human rights abuses by government and opposition groups left, according to some estimates, over 40,000 people dead and forced hundreds of thousands to flee. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon.
We must stop the violence and flows of arms to both sides and set in motion a Syria-led transition as soon as possible.
The UN Security Council could not agree on action to stop the bloodshed. US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
The international community should say with one voice, without hesitation or caveat, that the killings of innocent Syrians must stop and a political transition must begin.
But some argued for caution. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
There is no doubt whatsoever that the Syrian authorities bear a huge share of responsibility for the situation. But one shouldn't ignore the fact that for a long time now they have been fighting not unarmed men, but combat units such as the Syrian Free Army and extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda.
Well, Dr. Cairo, that shows some of the really horrific violence taking place in Syria. What can be done? Let's just assume that the Security Council is not moving at this point and may not, although the pressure seems to be building up on Russia and China at this juncture. Right. But what can be done by other countries of the world? And I know the UN system, we were talking a minute ago about the UN agencies. They are on the ground helping people.
Right.
That
They're active.
You have a lot of non-governmental organizations that are in there providing humanitarian assistance. But what could be done perhaps to resolve that, or at least ameliorate or tone down some of the violence and some of the suffering?
Well, it's a very difficult problem, as you're well aware, and very complex. Russia has recently said that Bashar al-Assad's days might be coming to an end, suggesting perhaps some movement by the Russians here, although it's unlikely that there's going to be any major movement by the Russians. Part of the problem lies not only in the government versus opposition, but opposition versus opposition problem. And this reflects a little bit of why the United States perhaps hasn't done more. Within the opposition, you have a more moderate opposition group, and you have the more radical jihadist opposition group. And they're both vying for control of the opposition to the government, in a sense. And there are communities that are literally being torn apart, not just by the government versus the opposition, but the opposition versus the opposition. And the United States, of course, is leery about stepping into a conflict where they essentially give radical jihadists additional power. This is part of the problem, of course, in North Africa, and part of what many on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee are blaming the administration for not paying enough attention to in the whole Libya, Benghazi crisis. So it's a lot more complicated than simply stepping in, and I think one of the reasons why the United States isn't doing more is because of the elements of radical jihadism that are present in Syria as well.
You know, the Middle East and the Gulf, it's a fascinating area of the world. It's an important area of the world. It's a geopolitical, strategically vital and viable area of the world. Rich culture, a tremendous history and that type of thing. Now, you've captured a large part of that, I guess, in your book. I've started it, I haven't finished it. It's a great book. It's the Gulf, the Bush presidencies, and the Middle East.
Yes.
And let me just ask you in general terms, I know you can't summarize 285 pages
Asking
or whatever.
a professor to summarize what they've written on is not an easy
in under
task.
50 minutes, right?
That's right.
But what is the gist of the book?
Well, I started this book when the second Bush was elected. And one of the things that I started to notice was a lot of journalists, scholars, practitioners were suggesting that George W. Bush was merely an Act Two of George H.W. Bush. And my premise is that it's far from an Act Two. That in fact George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush had very different views of the world, very different strategies in approaching the world. And in Iraq you see that certainly. You could talk about multilateralism versus unilateralism. The utilization of the UN, for example, in the first Persian Gulf War versus the almost disdain for the UN by many within the George W. Bush administration in Operation Iraqi Freedom. And so I'm looking at specifically how these two men at the top differed in their styles and leadership and how that played into the decision-making processes in the Middle East.
And that March 19th, 2013 will mark the 10th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And when we think back to that period, the information we find out now, a lot of people knew it even back then.
Yes.
Dr. Hans Blix, who headed up the UN observation team, UNMOVIC, I guess it was, in Iraq, said, he told me personally, he said he thought that maybe Saddam Hussein had reconstituted his weapons program. But when they went in, they talked to the scientists, they went through everything they could go through, and he said they came to the conclusion that they did not have weapons of mass destruction. But we see that a lot of the information that was cherry-picked, it was information that basically they tried to support a war in Iraq, and we come to find out there were no weapons of mass destruction. And of course now we see we've got over $1 trillion bill that's basically, it's cost the United States in particular to go into Iraq. Iraq is on the failed country list right now. It's one of the ones that at any point could become even more of a failed state. What have we learned from that as it might apply to this whole discussion of Iran? And a lot of people are rattling the saber and thinking, you know, we need to go into Iran. Are there any lessons we can learn from it?
I think one thing is we've got to separate out who has learned from that, because there are still a lot of neocons out there that it seems that they haven't learned much from that. Their lesson is that Iraq, neoconservatives, right? Their lesson is that Iraq was a success, that we got rid of a dictator who was involved in human rights violations, we established a democracy. Now, a lot of people right now are questioning that democracy in the streets of Iraq, and whether it's really a democracy or it's some other form of an authoritarian leadership or pseudo-democracy. One thing we know about the George W. Bush administration is that their very first discussions were about Iraq. I suggest that Iraq wasn't something that came on the radar screen after 9/11, Rather, 9/11 provided the catalyst to do what they had planned from the beginning. So I think one thing we learned specifically as voters, as Americans, and we should think about, is to really pay attention to the leaders and people around them who are advising them when we have elections. Iran is a very dangerous case here. Most recently, Ehud Barak, the Ministry of Defense in Israel, going to step down now, has said that Israel was considering things short of war. Now they've admitted that this was going on. Now Netanyahu hasn't admitted that, but certainly others have suggested this. It's the same kind of complications in Syria in terms of an intervention that you start to bring in here, and certainly could cause major problems throughout the Middle East. In Iraq, of course, you're well aware of the ethnic and religious conflicts that were there, that were simmering, that when we went in became much worse. So there are consequences to democracy. It's not to say that people shouldn't have democracy, but there are consequences that we need to consider.
And that flashes back too to 2002, especially when they had the debate at the United Nations. And of course, the legal way to have done this would have been to have gotten a resolution passed by the United Nations Security Council, but they didn't have the votes. They could not get it. It never came up for a vote.
Well, in fact, this is one area that we could say is problematic sometimes for the United Nations, and that's at the Security Council, where you had a resolution, 1441, where the Bush administration was arguing, this resolution gives us the authority to do what we have to do, with or without further support. Yet you had the French, Russians, and Chinese interpreting that same resolution as saying, no, this resolution suggests that once you see a material breach on the ground in Iraq, you have to come back to the United Nations and get additional authority. One thing that is clear from, and I'm sure you're aware of this, Bill, is that the United Nations sometimes in negotiations and in trying to get a negotiation creates an ambiguous negotiation. And 1441 is an example of that ambiguity that in some ways allowed the Bush administration to push forward and make their case, at least within the United States, even if it wasn't being accepted elsewhere.
Exactly. And of course, even though the majority of the countries at the UN and the people around the world, the polls showed the vast majority of the then 6 billion people opposed the invasion of Iraq and viewed it as an illegal invasion of a sovereign country.
Absolutely.
But even after that happened and the United States did invade, then the countries at the UN said, well, what's done is done. Now we have to help the Iraqi people to rebuild. And it comes as a great surprise to a lot of folks, especially in the United States, that many UN agencies are the backbone of the reconstruction process going on in Iraq right now, with UNESCO, the UN Children's Fund, just on across the board of those agencies.
Well, part of the problem there was that the Bush administration had not adequately prepared for after the removal of Saddam Hussein. There was an assumption that this would be easy, this would be quick, and that the United States would be accepted as liberators. And that once that happened, everything would fall into place. But what we often forget is that many of the countries in the Middle East are creations of great powers. And a lot of the problems we're seeing now, Saddam Hussein, despite all of the evilness associated with him, was keeping under wraps, and particularly the differences between the Kurds and the Shia and the Sunni that existed in the country. That's not to say that we should have kept Saddam Hussein in power, but certainly the considerations that go into an intervention like this need to be much deeper than what we saw from the Bush administration and be considered much further. Because you're right, there was a great irony in the United States basically going back to the UN and saying, bail us out now, after sort of flouting them and saying, we're not interested in what you do earlier on.
And that, of course, was, well, the administration, as you mentioned, George W. Bush, did not really interact with the UN much right after the invasion, but after things started to fall apart in Iraq, then they did interact quite a bit with the United Nations because they desperately needed the United Nations assistance to shore up the situation over there, to overcome some of the problems. You please go ahead.
Well, and they desperately were concerned that there would be a nation-building episode that would be a failure as elections approached, too, which is something important to think about, if you're a politician, certainly. So
that's always in the backs of the minds,
yes,
I'm sure.
absolutely.
Next election.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Well, you mentioned a minute ago Ehud Barak, and if we could shift gears and move from Iraq over to Israel and to Gaza and the Palestinian Authority,
Absolutely.
or now the State of Palestine.
Yeah.
We've got a clip on some of the conditions that took place in 2012, especially in November when there was a conflict. And of course, we think back to, golly, I guess it was back in 2008, 2009,
Yep.
when there was a major incursion by the Israelis into the Gaza Strip. And of course, it was just tremendous devastation. There's a huge amount of destruction and suffering.
Right.
But anyway, let's go back and look at the situation in 2012, and we'll come back and talk about it in just a moment. But let's go to the video.
Great.
In Gaza, a new cycle of violence erupted after months of standstill in negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon headed to the region to personally appeal for a ceasefire. In late November, a great majority of countries approved a UN General Assembly resolution to elevate Palestine to a non-member observer state at the UN.
Well, Dr. Cairo, that shows, I think, very vividly some of the misunderstandings, if you will, or some of the hostilities that exist between the Israelis and the Palestinians and the situation. In November, I guess it was November 29th, 2012, there was a major vote that was held at the United Nations.
Yes.
And it was really a very lopsided vote. It was like 138 in favor of, 9 opposed to, and 41 abstentions to really upgrade the Palestinian Authority from its status as an entity to a non-member observer state, I guess is what it was. The same as the Vatican has,
Yeah.
which means it can participate in various United Nations agencies' discussions. How important is that?
Well, it's very important. I mean, it's not just a matter of participation, it's a matter of utilization, too, in some cases. You know, it means that they can utilize various agencies to pressure Israel. They can bring out various things that Israel is doing or not doing in an international forum and bring this under international scrutiny at the United Nations. So it's important in that sense, as sort of a PR sense, we might call that, or a global awareness sense. It's also important for the Palestinian people themselves in terms of giving them a feeling of legitimacy about their land and the land that they believe is theirs, I should say, and about the dispute. There are issues there. We talked beforehand about issues that come under international law that we often don't think of. Law of the sea issues. Who now controls those territories? Airspace issues, you know, that certainly could become significant issues for the Palestinians as well. In this discussion. So.
Exactly. And it seems like at least lip service is paid to this by the Israelis, by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, by Mahmoud Abbas, that they want a two-state solution. And that entails that they live in peace with one another, that they recognize one another's borders, that the Israelis are not threatened by mortars coming across from the Gaza.
Yeah.
The people in Gaza have access to their own borders. They can come and go as they wish or whatever. They have control of their airspace. What kind of remedy, what kind of solutions could we suggest? I know we've been wrestling with this problem.
If I had
since
the
1948.
solutions, I think I'd be in a different spot. Perhaps,
Exactly.
You know, there are no easy solutions here because it goes beyond simply recognizing, let's say, the right to exist for Israel and the Palestinian state on the other side. It goes to the settlements within the West Bank, for example, where you have Jewish Israeli citizens in those settlements, who have established a home there. How does that impact them? It goes to, the border crossings and how that might impact relations between the two states if they were to exist as well. So it's much more complicated than the rhetoric would suggest. And in fact, I would suggest to you that the rhetoric is often rhetoric. I mean, if I'm Netanyahu, I don't want to go to before everyone and say, yeah, no, we're shutting that place down. We're gonna corral even more. Unfortunately, I've been in Israel. The wall works for Israel. So I don't know if there is a real incentive in some of this for the Israeli government to offer more than they perhaps need to offer to get the Palestinians to the table. And of course, there's the internal conflict in Palestine between Hamas and Fatah, and what that means as well.
Exactly. It certainly is. It's a very complex situation. And you hear about the right of return for the Palestinians who are now living in Jordan or wherever it might be, coming back into the area. You hear about the settlements, which are a major stumbling block because a lot of those settlements are built on land that Palestinians lived on for eons and eons. So it's a very difficult situation.
Well, you have another situation, that's water, that we often don't think
That's
about.
a
But
major
water is a
problem.
key situation.
It is.
And Israel controls the water flow, in essence. And so, a state without resources is what Palestine would be. And that would be a very difficult situation.
It is often said that water will be the oil or the petroleum of the 21st century because of the climate change, its changing patterns, the increasing populations, and just a variety of other factors that are playing into desertification is taking place.
Right.
And you find situations where people who had water for all of their lives no longer are having access to that water. We see that the glaciers are melting in the Altiplano in Bolivia and various countries like that. So things have certainly changed. We've moved from the Middle East to South America. But
That's okay. That's okay. I mean, water is extremely important. And you've been to Israel as well. You know that in areas of the West Bank, in Palestinian homes, they have large containers on their roof collecting rainwater so that when Israel decides to shut water off, they have access to some form of water. So it's important.
They certainly do, yes. Well, it's a very important part of the world. It's a beautiful area of the world, wonderful people, and we need to learn much more about the Middle East, and you've certainly helped us a lot through your book, The Gulf, the Bush Presidencies, and the Middle East. But Dr. Michael Cairo, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Appreciate
you
it very much.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.